Welcome everyone to this very special session by the Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence on the intersection between gender-based violence and climate change. I'm your moderator for today's session. My name is Barra. I'm the chair of the Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence and the CEO of THROCRA, an Irish NGO. My panelists today include three very special speakers. Nancy Waegao is the Gender Equality Project Manager from the Solomon Islands, and she will speak to us today about her experience working in the Solomon Islands with World Vision, looking at gender equality and the impact of climate change on women, girls at community level. Our second panelist is Carolina Amaya, who's a social worker from El Salvador, who has been a long-term committed member of civil society activism, including the political committee of the Central America Vulnerable Forum, which is a climate advocacy platform. For 20 years, she has been a leader in environmental and climate advocacy at both national level and at regional levels in El Salvador and in Central America. And finally, Grace Malera is the Ombudsman in Malawi. Grace was appointed to this role of Ombudsman in September 2021. She's a highly regarded lawyer in Malawi and a human rights expert with almost 20 years of experience in both the public and the non-governmental sector. Prior to holding the role of Ombudsman, she was Executive Director of ActionAid in Malawi, and she was also the Executive Secretary of the Malawi Human Rights Commission. So we have a wonderful set of speakers today. To everyone who's participating, I'd like to first of all let you know that we are recording this session and that you can put your questions at any point in the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of your screen. We will use the chat function only to send you a link to our new policy paper, which is just being published today. But please put your questions at any moment in the Q&A. Also, I would like to point out that there is interpretation into and out of Spanish available. So please go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and choose either English or Spanish. So with the housekeeping all done, I would like to move into the formal proceedings. First of all, I need to give apologies from Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason from the Irish Permanent Mission to the UN in New York, who would very much have liked to have been with us today, but unfortunately is not able to attend. However, I do have some remarks that Ambassador Byrne-Nason would like to contribute, and I will come back to those at the end of the session. But let us get straight into the meat of the discussion this morning. So Nancy, if it might come to you first. In fact, let me come to Grace Malera first. Grace, Malawi is a country that is affected both by long-term climate change, but also that suffers greatly from sudden onset disasters such as floods, such as drought. Could you maybe describe to us what is the impact of climate change on women, and specifically how does it impact gender-based violence in Malawi?
Thank you. Thank you so much. And a big welcome to all those that are listening to us. In terms of sharing the Malawi experience, perhaps my starting point is going to restate a fact. I think that is not unique to Malawi, which is that we all know that climate change hugely affects already existing gender inequalities. And this brings about a lot of negative impacts for women and girls, and in particular where sexual and gender-based violence is concerned. So for the Malawi situation, to begin with, I would highlight the fact that we do have a very progressive legal framework where women's rights are concerned, the sexual gender-based violence issues, protection and service delivery, consented implementation of the laws, the policies that we have. In a situation of climate change, then we begin to see an increase in issues of sexual and gender-based violence for a number of reasons. I think the major contributing factor that I wanted to highlight on today is the issue of poverty. and we have read a lot of publications, and that's not only in Malawi. I think it's across the globe. And we all know the inextricable link between poverty and climate change. So these two, the interplay of these two factors then exacerbates the situation of women, pushing them more into places of more vulnerability when it comes to subjection to sexual and gender-based violence. A quick example I can highlight for Malawi is our high rates of early and child marriages. With or without climate change, that is a challenge. When climate change is brought into the picture, when you have instances of floods, hunger, famine, the situation of girls today, Malawi has 9%, has a huge percentage, 42% of our girls that get married before they are 18. And you can imagine the situation of disasters, floods, and how then it forces more and more girls into impoverished positions and enhances their vulnerability to sexual and gender-based violence. I also want to highlight that when those situations occur, they also bring about other heightened situations of subjection to sexual and gender-based violence in the camps, for example, in the provision of shelter. There was a publication at some point that talked about the sex for relief food, where some women would be forced to offer internally displaced situation. And maybe that's a way out for them. Then we also look at the inaccessibility of services and how programming sometimes tends to put women's only services as a footnote or as a second thought. So a disaster has happened, you're bringing in one size fits all solutions. Let us provide shelter, let us make sure that there's food rations and so on. But are we stopping to think, how about lactating mothers? You know, how about the sanitary needs of the women? And finally, I think I also see in the context of Malawi, climate change having implications for livelihoods generally, but more importantly, where women and girls are concerned because of the gendered roles that we play in this society. So in a typical day-to-day setting, it is the woman that has got to fetch water. It is the woman that has got to go out and fetch firewood. Unfortunately, we're still using a lot of firewood for energy. It is the woman that has got to do all the care work in the homes where the livelihoods have been disrupted. It is the woman who probably just depends on subsistence farming. And that tends to be hugely impacted by disasters, unlike maybe those that are into commercial farming, for instigating mechanisms more than the subsistence farmers. So you see that through and through, however way you look at issues of climate change and the intersection with women's lives, you see that women tend to be at the bottom ladder, including when it comes to making decisions on what should happen, accessing information on early warnings, for example. Much of that information, is it in formats that women can easily access? No. We have high literacy rates of our women. We have women that are excluded from access to technology, for example, radio. Radio is a luxury. Cell phone technology is a luxury. So if you ask me, I would say the context of Malawi typically demonstrates, you know, the vulnerability of women and girls to issues of climate change. And in particular, when you bring about the sexual and gender-based violence lanes, given their disempowered positions, given the gender inequalities. And for me, as we keep talking, I'll then be looking at how do we center these experiences in our programming on climate change. from a gender perspective. Thank you, Carmen.
Grace, thank you very much. And I think we'll definitely come back to that question about how do we center women and girls in our responses, because that is the critical question. Let me maybe turn now to Nancy. So Nancy, in the Solomon Islands, many of us will be very familiar with hearing about the geophysical, if you like, impact of climate change in the Solomon Islands. So for example, warmer seawater, coral bleaching, sea level rises, coastal erosion. But could you talk to us for a few minutes about, well, what is the impact of climate change on women and girls? And in particular, do you see it having an impact on gender-based violence levels in the Solomon Islands?
Thank you very much. In Solomon Islands, it is made up of more than 900 islands, and most people live along the coastal area. So the increase in disasters and extreme climate events that linked with climate change has a huge impact on women, more than men, due to its complexity that threatens the lives of vulnerable women and girls in the global south. We've seen that women are highly dependent on natural resources, such as water, for household tasks, and frequently for farming. Agriculture and fishing are the largest sources of national income, as well as for consumption in the region, followed by mineral mining, timber, and tourism. Women and girls are vulnerable to the causes and effects of climate change because they depend so much on marine resources as part of this food security. Due to the continuous rains and floods, it also affects food gardens, leaving people without food to feed their families. Women also travel very long distances to fetch water once there is continuous shortage of water, especially on the coastal areas where people live. They can be vulnerable to sexual violence and rape due to the scorching heat and continuous rain. It also increases vector-borne diseases such as malaria and fever. These inequalities made women vulnerable to the disease that swept through the communities. Women domestic burdens and increased hardships. There is evidence that floods increase women's domestic burdens. The loss of utensils and other household essentials is a great hardship. And floods also undermine women's well-being in general because of their dependence on economic activities that link to the home. The decline of fish population caused by coral bleaching can provide less food supply to the communities. Due to lack of provision of food in the family, it also leads to stress, tensions that triggers violence, and mostly women are the victims. So gender-based violence is already a global pandemic. And with the effects of COVID-19, it poses a huge, huge impact to the lives of the already vulnerable women in the islands as they face multiple shocks, and their repercussion to COVID-19 reduces household finances as well as elevated food price. Lastly, due to the sea level rise, children are vulnerable to drowning. So climate change in the Solomons had a huge negative impact to the lives of women and girls. Thank you.
Nancy, thank you very much. And you paint a very stark picture there. It's very clear and very immediate what the impact is on women and girls, and just really struck as well by how you describe the multiple crises that are affecting people. Not only have we climate change, which is ongoing in the background and which is cumulative, we all know that, you cannot row back on it, but also the impact of COVID and how that has disproportionately affected women who are the caregivers. But also you mentioned food price increases. And just to note that we are all very aware that the crisis in Ukraine is going to exacerbate a lot of the issues for women, because women are the primary caregivers. They have primary responsibility for ensuring that there is food on the table within households. And as food prices are set to rise globally, we know that this is going to add to what you have described as the global pandemic of GBV that pre-existed our current crises. But Nancy, thank you very much for your input there. Carolina, if I may turn to you, you work in a very distinct environment. You're a female human rights defender working with other women human rights defenders. Human rights defenders are protecting the environment, protecting land, water sources, in your case in El Salvador, but throughout the region. How do you see the impact of climate change resulting in increased gender-based violence, specifically for women human rights defenders?
Bueno, primero plantearte que si bien es cierto, las afectaciones de las mujeres son más drásticas con relación a otra población, también es cierto que son las mujeres las que están en la primera línea de resistencia en la defensa de los territorios. Es decir, están defendiendo el agua frente a las corporaciones e industrias mineras, están defendiendo los bosques frente a la expansión sin control de monocultivos, en el caso de El Salvador, por el tema de la caña, en el caso de Guatemala y Honduras con la palma africana. Entonces, en esas conflictividades de resistencia por la disputa del territorio, por la disputa del agua, también son las mujeres las que están en esa primera línea de resistencia. De cara a estas múltiples crisis, ¿verdad? Uno esperaría que los estados respondan a los intereses estratégicos de las mujeres, no solo porque somos las más afectadas, sino porque en el caso de El Salvador y a nivel mundial somos la mayor parte de la población. Por lo tanto, uno esperaría que las políticas públicas vinculadas a fortalecer esa resiliencia de cara a las afectaciones por el cambio climático tengan como eje central o estén sustentados sobre las necesidades claves o las necesidades estratégicas de las mujeres. Sin embargo, lo que vemos en este rol, en esta mirada de defensoras del territorio, de defensoras ambientales, lo que vemos en el caso de la región centroamericana y concretamente El Salvador, de donde yo soy, es un retroceso de esos estados de derecho, ¿verdad? Como lo estamos viendo en este gobierno. Hay un lamentable cierre de esos espacios de diálogo, hay retrocesos en términos de políticas públicas, y ese estado de derecho lo que estamos viendo es que hay una concentración más de poder de parte de los gobernantes. Es decir, ese mantenimiento de ese Estado de Derecho incipiente, sin duda que nos coloca a nosotros como mujeres en una posición más de sumisión y en una posición más de exposición, en la que se nos es vulnerado también no solo los derechos, ¿verdad? Vinculados al acceso al agua, vinculados al derecho a alimentación, sino que también esos derechos vinculados a la defensa del territorio. Y muchas de las respuestas de los estados que uno esperaría que estarían en función de garantizar esos derechos, vea que hoy por hoy están más expuestos de cara a esas múltiples crisis, lo que vemos son estados más represivos, estados más que estigmatizan y por supuesto deslegitiman las labores y las apuestas que las mujeres ya realizamos desde esa protección del territorio, desde esa protección de la biodiversidad. Hay algunos ejemplos que yo quisiera como mencionar y creo que es importante la respuesta de la comunidad también internacional en términos de observar, ¿verdad? Estos escenarios de criminalización de los defensores ambientales, estos escenarios de asesinato de defensores y defensoras ambientales, pero no quedarse solo en la observación también. Es necesario pronunciarse, ¿verdad? Particularmente ante los riesgos específicos de la labor que ejercemos como mujeres defensoras, ¿verdad? De la labor que ejercen las mujeres periodistas, ¿verdad? De la labor que ejercen todas aquellas personas que hacemos un rol a esta sociedad de defensa de los derechos humanos. Entonces, esos roles también importantes de la comunidad internacional frente a estos contextos, es importante plantearlos también en demandas hacia los estados. Por ejemplo, en El Salvador y en la región centroamericana, solo 2 países han firmado el acuerdo de Escazú, un acuerdo que tiene a su base derecho a la información, derecho a la participación, derecho a la justicia, al acceso a la justicia y derecho a la protección de los defensores y las defensoras ambientales. Entonces, ese rol también de la comunidad internacional, no solo de cara a el tema de la ambición climática, sino que también de cara a observar cómo los estados están garantizando estos derechos particularmente de las mujeres y de aquella población que estamos en esa condición de ecodependencia de los bienes naturales. Y por supuesto, demandas también hacia los estados de darle cumplimiento a esos compromisos internacionales, ¿verdad? Como la Convención Marco de Cambio Climático y sus propuestas que se gestan desde las contribuciones nacionales determinadas, mejor conocidas como NDC, o esos acuerdos, por ejemplo, que aunque son latinoamericanos, pero hay también mucha incidencia de la comunidad internacional, ya que va en la línea de la protección de los defensores y las defensoras, como es el Acuerdo de Escazú. Estamos, en conclusión, en esa primera línea de afectaciones por los eventos extremos derivados del cambio climático, pero también estamos en la primera línea de la resistencia por la defensa de ese territorio. Por lo tanto, hay dobles y triples afectaciones, desde el incremento de la jornada doméstica, por el tiempo que implica proveerse de agua, proveerse de leña, pero también desde los riesgos que conlleva la defensa y la protección del territorio que ejercemos mayoritariamente las mujeres, ¿verdad? En materia de defensoría ambiental.
Carolina, thank you very much. And I'll come back to you with a question on how you see women and men, human rights defenders, I guess, suffering differently as a result of their gender and gender norms in your context, because I believe that, you know, women human rights defenders are at risk in different ways sometimes than their counterparts, male human rights defenders. But I also want to ask Grace, after you've answered this question, Carolina, I'm going to ask Grace to come back in, because Grace, you mentioned, if I understand correctly, that the legal context in Malawi is relatively progressive, whereas in Carolina's context, the legal context is getting much, much worse. It's going backwards. So we'll come back to that in a minute, because I think it'll be interesting to see how does the legal context enable or block progress. And also I think there's an important point around women's participation in decision-making. Carolina, just to come back to you, because you started with the point that women are in the front lines of resistance, but that comes at a cost. So at a practical level, what are the kinds of costs? What's the impact on a woman or maybe on her family of being a human rights defender in the environmental sphere?
Bueno, usted ha comenzado hablando de la familia. Muchas veces el ejercer esta labor de defensor y defensora no siempre se tiene el respaldo de la familia. Entonces hay también se genera un conflicto interno en la familia, ¿verdad? Porque no solo se expone a la persona defensora, sino que se expone de manera general a la familia. Por lo tanto, lo que tenemos es un rompimiento de ese tejido social al interior de la familia, pero también al interior de la comunidad, ¿verdad? Porque las corporaciones trabajan muy finamente, ¿verdad? Para dividir ese tejido social comunitario de tal forma de ya no poner en contra a la comunidad, poner en contra a la familia. En esa línea también es importante plantear la deslegitimación que se nos hace a las mujeres defensoras. Es decir, de que una no necesita ser hidróloga, ¿verdad? Ser geógrafa, ser experta en cambio climático para saber que si deforestas 80 manzanas de bosque natural, vas a tener una reducción de la infiltración de agua en las comunidades. Entonces, cuando se plantean, por ejemplo, este tipo de demandas, este tipo de mensajes, muchas compañeras en El Salvador, ¿verdad?, han sido denunciadas por las corporaciones por calumnias, porque se está calumniando a la empresa, porque se está desprestigiando a la empresa. Entonces, este tipo que muchas veces estos casos llegan hasta los tribunales, ¿verdad? En donde se quiere obligar a las mujeres a pedir disculpas y a retractarnos también por ese tipo de mensajes. Entonces tenemos por un lado la deslegitimación de las mujeres, ¿verdad? Muchas veces por no ostentar este tipo de títulos, porque este tipo de títulos pareciera que nos acreditan para tener la certificación de hablar, ¿verdad?, técnica y científicamente, y no hablar desde la vivencia y desde la presencia que tenemos, desde ese conocimiento que tenemos de los territorios. Por lo tanto, es importante para ejercer esa defensoría ambiental tener mucho del respaldo de esa familia, ese respaldo de ese tejido social comunitario y por supuesto, ¿verdad? La protección de los estados, que en muchos de los casos no necesariamente funciona de esta forma. Lejos de ello, lo que tenemos es bastante el rechazo, ¿verdad? De la familia y por la exposición que se da, ¿verdad? Porque las amenazas no solo son para las defensoras, sino también para la familia en su conjunto.
Carolina, thank you very much. And I'm going to come back over to Grace now. Grace, what do you think about this? So women, you know, in going out and taking leadership positions, they're putting themselves at risk because they're defying the normal social norms, being that women should be at home, the caregivers, etc. So they're breaking those social norms, and that creates risk for them. But women's voice is so important in decision-making. What are your reflections on that from your perspective? And also given what you said about the legal environment that you have, how can the legal environment plus the social environment be made more enabling for women to be part of the decision-making? Grace, if you wouldn't mind just unmuting there.
Thank you so much. So my first take on that question would be just to demonstrate the legal framework. Briefly, that would be number one, the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, entrenching human rights, including women's rights, and also prescribing policy principles for policy formulation, and one of which is that the attainment of gender equality. So when one looks at the text of the Constitution, maybe your reaction is, oh, it can't get any better than this. And then we have followed up on the Constitution over the years, enacting gender-related laws, and there's a whole litany of those laws: prevention of domestic violence, the Penal Code, of course, Disability Act, and so on and so forth, including an anti-trafficking legislation. And you have policies and programs upon programs. But if you ask me, the totality of that body of laws and policies is so disconnected in terms of impact from the lived realities of women in Malawi. So immediately for me, the conclusion I draw, which may not also just not be specific to Malawi, is it is not enough to have progressive laws and policies. One, there's got to be clearly demonstrable political commitment and political will to make those laws, turn them into reality. Number one, funding and investment in women's and girls' rights, which is seriously lacking for most countries. If you look at the budget for Malawi.
Grace, I'm very sorry, but we're getting some. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Grace.
Our Ministry of Gender is one of government ministries. Now, development aid that comes. Can you hear me now?
Sorry,
Is
Grace.
this audible?
The internet connection is a bit weak. I wonder, would you mind turning off your camera so we can hear you a bit better? My apologies.
Yeah.
Thank you, and please
Yes.
continue.
No problem. I hope this helps. Yeah.
Great,
So
great.
I was speaking about political commitment, clearly demonstrated by adequate funding to women's and girls' rights issues of disability and social inclusion, and typically through the Ministry of Gender. If you look at the Malawi example, the Ministry of Gender is one of the least funded. Beyond demonstrating the political will is also investing in capacities. So when you look at, for example, the response services for gender-based violence, psychosocial services, there's not so much to point at in the Malawi context. The medical services, the police, the justice system, how responsive are these systems? For Malawi, I think there's still a whole lot of room for improvement. So that tells you that we can have all the progressive laws in the world, but if we are not purposeful in making sure that those laws are being implemented and enforced, I think we'll keep seeing the kind of indicators, the poor indicators that we have where sexual and gender-based violence is concerned. And then coupled with that, when you've looked at the laws and the commitment around that, there is also a greater need to invest in prevention services. And for contexts like Malawi, that means going down the route of gender transformative programming, because our high rates of sexual and gender-based violence are largely reinforced by our gender norms, our social norms, the ways issues of masculinities are interpreted. And so we've done all the awareness raising. I make the argument that if we were to, to look at the amount of resources, the amount of investments, donors, INGOs, local organizations have made in awareness raising on issues around gender, you'd find that I think we are talking of big sums of investments. But it's not really amounting to the change that we want to see, because we are not tackling the root of those issues, which are the norms that people are socialized into. So an example I can give is, you find a household in rural Malawi that's willing to marry off a 14-year-old. They've been to gender awareness raising meetings, several of them. They've heard the messages, but these are messages that have not been packaged in ways that make people to begin to interrogate some of these norms, to begin to question, why do we do this, and what is the value systems that are underpinning some of these things. At the end of the day, we are doing awareness raising that is more of checklisting. When the people go back, they are back to what they know best, which is it's fine, it's normal, it's acceptable to have this young girl go into a marriage, unless and until we get to the root causes and we program our ways that our programs in ways that are gender transformative. I think we'll keep having this disconnect between what I'm calling a very progressive legal framework vis-a-vis the realities of women and girls in the lives of Malawians. So that addresses the first part of your question. Yes, we can learn from Malawi in terms of enacting these laws, how we manage to move our parliaments to give us these laws, but I think there's still more of the working to be done when it comes to implementation. The second component, very briefly, was on women rising to leadership positions, women's rights defenders, and the typical risks that we would face, these being considered normally highly male-dominated spheres. In fact, I think the case for Malawi would be that women's human rights defenders are so outnumbered by our male counterparts. And therefore, in my own experience, you become easy attacks against human rights defenders. And for me, another experience is also women's rights issues tend to be diligent about, particularly when it's also women fronting those issues in advocacy efforts. I think the usual label is, oh, the women are here again. What is it that they want to talk about now? Nobody is really paying attention, because society has it that it is men that should engage in those spaces. You also see characters assassinated. The typical question that goes, where are these women coming from? What is their character? Are they married? Are they this? Are they that? They've never asked about that of a male human rights defender. They've never said, wait a minute, is that man married? But it always comes up. And in a culture that highly values marriage, that becomes a deterrent sometimes for women to venture into these spaces. And then the threats against families. You put your children's lives at risk, sometimes your own life at risk. And of course, our security needs and those of men would be different. depending on the spaces where we find ourselves, but also access to resources. Most of the women's rights defenders, some of them are at the typical grassroots. They are in organizations that hardly know how to put up a proposal for successfully put up a proposal for donor funding. Compare that to majority of our male counterparts. Their capacities are so enhanced. So we are at a greater risk. We face certain peculiar risks that are so peculiar to us because of our agenda. But I think programming has still got a long way to go to truly and meaningfully integrate our experiences as women's rights defenders into the response that is out there. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Grace, thank you very much. I mean, that's interesting. In building on what Carolina has said to us, you really highlighted that, you know, the social context is incredibly important. So the social norms that are held at family level, at community level, at national level, you've described seeing those in effect right from a family where there's a 14-year-old girl who's at risk of being married off, right up to the national level where you have, I'm interpreting, people who are involved in policy making and policy influencing, questioning the legitimacy of women being at the table, which is very, very damaging. And as you say, those social norms come through again, where men question a woman's right to be present because she is a woman, because she has a role in society, which suggests that her role is as the wife, as the support, as the background person, rather than the person with an entitlement in and of herself to be present and participate in policy making and policy influencing. I want to come back to you, Nancy, to get a perspective from you, from the Solomon Islands, around this question of what can we do better for women environmental human rights defenders in climate-related crises? What actions do we specifically need to see from states and from donors to support women?
Thank you very much. So in emergencies such as in the effects of climate change, the risk of gender-based violence for women and girls and other marginalized groups can be exacerbated. This is one source from the UN Women that states globally violence against women and girls affects 1 in 3 women in a lifetime due to the impacts of climate change that brought about displacement, resource scarcity, food insecurity, and disruption to service provision to survivors. Focusing on minimum standards for gender-based violence in emergency programming is very important. Violence against women and girls limits women's participation, their leadership, their agency, which is critical for effective climate change mitigations, adaptation, resilience building efforts. So I have 5 action points here that needs to be addressed. Creating an enabling policy environment for the elimination of violence and violence against women and girls in the context of climate change. Increase investment in flexible and adaptive approaches to violence against women and girls, prevention and responses, prioritizing funding for women's empowerment programs, example, establishment of women's credit schemes in rural communities that encourage women to save money so they can earn and take small loans to support their families. Ensure that women have equal rights to opportunities in engagement in household discussions or level contributions to household incomes, as well as their participation in household decision-making. This also contributes to women's participation and economic contributions in local and national level. Thirdly, instead of holding men perpetrators accountable for the violence inflicted on women, we need to turn our focus to empowering men to become agents for change. I know there are so many good men out there, and even for those who are inflicting violence, it is because they were not fully aware of the effects of what they have been doing. We can provide programs and educate men on behavioral change attitudes. They can influence other men perpetrators to change to perceive women as equal beings. We are all created in the image of God. We share equal roles and responsibilities, and having that mutual respect for each other. Fourthly, due to the effects of COVID-19, there are so many restrictions in movements and most of our rural populace could not access the needed information they require. Therefore, dissemination of information can be done using text blasts, TVs, and through national radio stations. And lastly, it is vital that practitioners from the field of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction who are committed to developing gender response programs make these linkages explicit for all development practitioners through advocacy, awareness, and actions. It is also essential that best practice, lessons learned on gender responsive programming are widely shared across relevant sectors. Thank you.
Nancy, thank you very much. That was really clear. And what's great about it is that it's really concrete. All of the suggestions that you have made there are things that are achievable with the right focus, resources, and as Carolina earlier said, political will. I want to come back to you, Carolina. I think it's important that we hear a little bit more from you in terms of what needs to change and how. Do you think, firstly, my first question to you, are the concerns of environmental human rights defenders getting enough visibility within climate debates? So as female human rights defenders, in the context of climate debates, does this question about protection of female human rights defenders get enough attention? And then my second question is, what do you think states and donors can do to support female environmental human rights defenders in their critical work in the context of climate change?
Bueno, a mí me parece que no se tiene primero ni el reconocimiento, ¿verdad?, al rol que se ejerce como mujer en materia de defensoría ambiental. O sea, muchos de estos procesos son más atribuidos, ¿verdad? Y hay un reconocimiento más hacia los hombres que hacia las mujeres. Las mujeres, aunque somos las que estamos mayormente afectadas, las que estamos más en la defensa del territorio, pero ese reconocimiento, hay todo un sistema, ¿verdad?, que reconoce más esa labor a los hombres que lo que reconoce a las mujeres. Es más, el mandato social, como lo decía la compañera de Malawi, el mandato social hacia las mujeres no es hacer una defensoría ambiental. El mandato social es quedarnos en el espacio más privado, ¿verdad?, quedarnos en la casa y asumir más esos roles tradicionales, domésticos, de cuidado, y no ese rol más político, ese rol más de liderazgo hacia fuera de la casa, es decir, en el contexto comunitario. Es importante promocionar y visibilizar esos roles que ejercemos las mujeres defensoras, no solo desde la línea de la defensa, sino también en la línea de la multiplicación de conocimientos en la casa, en la comunidad, en la línea de conservación de la biodiversidad, conservación de las semillas, en la línea de conservación de los bosques. Si hay todavía bosques, si hay todavía agua en este planeta, hay que agradecérselo a las mujeres rurales y hay que agradecérselo a las mujeres indígenas, quienes históricamente han ejercido esa labor de defensa del territorio sin reconocimiento alguno. Ahora bien, ¿por dónde pueden ir como las apuestas y las propuestas de cara a los donantes, a las instituciones internacionales, etcétera? Muchas de estas intervenciones, mi recomendación es que si queremos realmente que las mujeres asuman o que se fortalezcan esos roles de transformar esas realidades en el territorio, ¿verdad? Hay que priorizar la participación de las mujeres y principalmente de los pueblos indígenas y de las mujeres indígenas. De esta forma nos estamos asegurando mucho del éxito, no solo vinculado al tema de adaptación climática, ¿verdad?, sino que también al tema de mitigación climática. Es decir, ahí están los saberes, ahí están muchas de las costumbres en materia de esa relación de respeto con la naturaleza, que es determinante y clave para encontrarle muchas de las respuestas a esta crisis climática. La compañera el que me antecedió hablaba bastante el tema de la brecha en cuanto a la información. Yo creo que hay que acompañar también procesos, ¿verdad? Que conlleven a la reducción de esas brechas en cuanto a la información climática. Miren, sigue siendo un desafío las barreras del idioma. Mucha de esta información técnica, científica, que es clave para tomar decisiones en las comunidades en materia de mitigación o en materia de adaptación climática, mucha de esta información de las cumbres del clima, ¿verdad? Espacios en los cuales convergen tomadores de decisiones, sociedad civil, están en idiomas que no está al alcance de la población mayormente afectada. Por lo tanto, es importante, primero, el descodificar, ¿verdad? Esa información de tal forma que sea del entendimiento de estas poblaciones, ¿verdad? Principalmente de las mujeres, y por supuesto fortalecer esos procesos participativos en la toma de decisiones. No solo en la toma de decisiones vinculadas a estos espacios locales, sino que también queremos ser parte de las discusiones a nivel nacional. Queremos ser parte o somos parte de esas demandas también al Estado, pero queremos también ser parte de esos espacios en donde se toman estas decisiones internacionales que tienen que ver con la vida, ¿verdad? De las comunidades y particularmente de las mujeres. Es importante de tal forma fortalecer esos procesos de participación, fortalecer esos procesos de información, pero también acompañar, ¿verdad? Acompañar a las mujeres en esas asesorías y en esos procesos para levantar esa voz por la justicia climática, para visibilizar esos roles, ¿verdad? Que estamos haciendo de protección, de recuperación, de restauración de ecosistemas, ¿verdad? Pero también para denunciar esas violaciones también a los derechos humanos, esas violaciones a los derechos en estas multiplicidad de crisis, ¿verdad? Crisis de acceso al agua, crisis de calidad del agua, crisis de la seguridad alimentaria, crisis climática, crisis energética, ¿verdad? Y que muchas veces lo que se requiere es subir el volumen y subir también de nivel, o sea, que esos problemas y esos conflictos locales, que esa defensoría del territorio a nivel local suba también a nivel nacional y suba también a nivel internacional. En el caso de El Salvador, muchas de estas demandas son ignoradas por el presidente y por este Estado de Derecho, pero ahí entra la comunidad internacional también como observadora, ¿verdad? Y como propositora también de cara a estos estados de derecho a generar estos procesos de información, de participación y acceso a la justicia para las mujeres.
Carolina, thank you very much. And I think that's really powerful what you're saying there. You know, when you started your intervention earlier on, you talked about women and women taking leadership roles, that women are in the forefront. Women are most affected, but also in the forefront of these challenges, and that there is a role for the international community to play in legitimizing what women are doing. And that in itself is a form of protection. But there are also practical steps that need to be taken to support and protect women at every step of their journey as female human rights defenders, including the important step of changing international norms and standards that set out to protect the environment and environmental and human rights defenders as well. And we might come back to that if we have time. I want to read out a comment by one of our participants, Natasha Wabwire, which I think is very important. So Natasha says, climate change has led to feminization of responsibilities as men migrate to look for income, while women are left with the burden of earning and managing households. In most societies, women have no support to take up these roles, or sometimes the education or knowledge that would equip them to do so. Their own government does not recognize, for example, women as landowners. Therefore, they're not able to benefit from government agricultural programs. And I just think that's extremely important because it speaks to another key topic that's emerging here, which is the importance of women having equal and equitable shares in control of assets and control of resources, but also in accessing the information and the knowledge that can enable them to use those assets and resources. So very, very basic things like equality around asset ownership, land ownership. And as you were speaking earlier, Grace, I was minded that in Malawi, women who are maybe marginalized, who maybe do not have a husband or a partner, or who might lose their husband, are often on the most marginal land, which is most prone to flooding, most prone to deforestation, most at risk, but they have least access to the supports that would enable them to get land title, to get supports to develop their land, etc. So I just think Natasha's comment there is very well made. We're moving into the last few minutes of this session, so I want to ask each of the participants one question before I move to wrap up. So my question to all of you, and I will start with Grace and then go to Nancy and finally Carolina. So while there is increased rhetorical commitment to addressing gender-based violence in climate crises, we hear from what you have said, this has not translated into adequate implementation, including implementation of the survivor-centered and women-centered response services that meet minimum standards in emergencies. Could you tell us what one action you would prioritize to make progress on implementation of standards to protect women from gender-based violence in the context of crisis around climate change? So Grace, if I could ask you, what is your one prioritized action that you would like to see taken?
I think for me, it's advocacy to governments, advocacy with INGOs and the donor community, that when we are building climate change resilience, climate change adaptation and mitigation, we must center the lived realities of women and girls, particularly where sexual and gender-based violence is concerned. That must be deliberate and purposeful. It must not be done on a second thought basis. It must not be done on the basis of tokenism. It must not be done, just as a matter of lip service, because we need to throw this phrase in this policy document, but it must be translated by meaningful action. So all those critical standard operating procedures for responding to gender-based violence, issues of safeguarding, they must be centered in that whatever we are going to call climate change adaptation and mitigation strategy that we are going to fund. I think for me, we need to heighten or intensify or take to scale our efforts around this. So all of those processes must be informed by gender assessments and looking at what will be the implications of this kind of situation to sexual and gender-based violence issues. How about the broader gender inequalities? How do they come into play and what do we want to do about it? So I would ask, my single ask would be for concerted efforts into deliberate programming and integration of ICGBV issues into climate change adaptation responses, as well as mitigation and resilience building. If I may add a line to the international community, to donors, if we are serious about investing in women leadership, in making women active participants in responding to issues of climate change, my own experience in Action Aid and other programs that I've led is that we also need flexibility in terms of our funding procedures and our funding conditionalities. Most of our grassroots women are not going to fill that proposal template that you bring along for us to access funds, let alone append their signatures, let alone produce to you audited accounts or show you a board of directors. So how do you go around that? How are we going to take forward women-led organizations if we restrict so much the conditionalities for accessing that aid? So we need flexibilities around that. We need to capacitate grassroots women's movements. They need to be in the forefront. You don't need a Grace Malera to lead a response in some remote area in Malawi. So we need that kind of empowerment. We need to rethink and redefine how we want to channel development aid if we are serious about women-led responses. Thank you.
Excellent, Grace. They were really, really well-made points. Thank you so much. Nancy, if I could come to you, what is your one priority action that you would like to see taken? Maybe if we're having Nancy, yeah, are you on the line there, Nancy? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So, yes. All right. So we believe that the government leaders, donors, and other participants are key players. We need to use the resources to fulfill existing commitments to ensure that the government prioritizes its funding to gender and climate change, similar to their priority in building infrastructure such as bridges and roads. Because we know that the cascading effects of gender-based violence in times of disaster is evident in the homes due to the multiple effects of what I have just mentioned. Commitments are not enough. We want real action to ensure women and girls and children are safe from all forms of violence during climate crisis. So I call on the government, donors, and other stakeholders to increase contribution to local adaptation funds for governments. Example, building seawalls to mitigate the effects of climate change. Focus to relocate people to safe locations, including climate improved infrastructures. Remember, in the islands, our islands are sinking. We are losing our islands. So our people need to relocate. This is one of my requests. Provide funding towards empowerment programming for women and girls in climate crisis. We need to enact and enforce laws that provides the rights of women and girls plus people with disabilities. We need to strengthen systems and services that support and protect women and girls, including gender-based violence prevention and responses that helps address critical needs, including mitigation, gender-based violence mainstreaming, capacity building. We need to develop a platform and program for women and girls to engage with the policymakers to raise the issues and work together to find common solution. I take a stand and I make it possible. Thank you.
Nancy, thank you so much. They're excellent points once again. And so now I'm going to give the floor to Carolina. Carolina, what is your top priority for action?
Bueno, los eventos extremos vinculantes al cambio climático materializan sus afectaciones en los temas de agua y en los temas de alimentación. Nosotros tenemos que, y esa es como la solicitud, plantear y más concretizar acciones vinculadas a asegurar el derecho humano al agua y el derecho a la alimentación. En contextos de sequía, por ejemplo, en El Salvador y en algunos países de la región centroamericana, hay mujeres que tenían que esperar hasta 3 horas para proveerse de un cántaro de agua. Y mucho de este trabajo tenían que hacerlo en horas nocturnas porque era cuando los nacimientos de agua estaban más solos. Destinar 3 horas para proveerse de un cántaro de agua es mutilar cualquier derecho, ¿verdad? Para progresar y para dignificar la vida de las mujeres. En El Salvador tenemos más del 100% de los ríos contaminados o severamente contaminados y un país con serios problemas de estrés hídrico. Por lo tanto, priorizar la protección de las zonas de recarga de agua, priorizar el acceso al agua como derecho humano y concretamente para las mujeres ha de ser una prioridad. En esa misma línea es importante trabajar en la protección y recuperación de las semillas ancestrales resilientes al cambio climático. Muchas de las respuestas a veces se piensan desde los escritorios cuando las verdaderas alternativas están ya gestándose desde hace muchos años, ¿verdad? En los territorios. Entonces es importante mirar hacia abajo, mirar hacia los territorios, mirar con lentes también ecofeminista, ¿verdad? Y por supuesto en el entendido que esto por sí solo no es posible. Ha de gestarse también, ¿verdad? Y ahí vienen las propuestas de incidencia en materia de políticas públicas que nos garanticen a las mujeres estos derechos de seguridad social, derechos ambientales, como los que he mencionado. Yo me quiero tomar un minuto del tiempo porque quisiera plantear otra demanda, y es el tema de que estos problemas son problemas globales y las respuestas han de ser también globales. Por lo tanto, yo siempre digo que el cambio climático es como el Titanic. O sea, en el Titanic primero se hundieron las clases bajas, pero luego venían las clases altas y las islas más altas. Entonces, poco a poco estamos viendo que las afectaciones ya no son en países como los nuestros, sino que está subiendo de nivel, ¿verdad? Por lo tanto, aquí es o nos salvamos en colectivo, ¿verdad? O vamos desapareciendo por separado. Entonces, la invitación es a construir de manera conjunta esas alternativas, ¿verdad? Nosotros desde esa presión hacia los estados para reducir esas brechas de género, esas brechas también sociales, económicas, pero también ustedes en este norte global también hacia más compromisos y mucho más rápidos de ambición climática para frenar ese chorro de emisiones que están generando este calentamiento global. Muchas gracias.
Carolina, thank you so much. And I'm very struck by your analogy to the Titanic. And I very much wish that we didn't need it as a message, that, you know, there'd be enough recognition of the inherent rights of every individual and that our inherent responsibility to protect those who are most vulnerable and to ensure no one is left behind, indeed. But I think the analogy of the Titanic might help to serve to help people understand that what is in everybody's interests is to protect the rights of the most vulnerable first. Just by way of conclusion, just to note that, as I mentioned at the outset, Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason had very much hoped to be with us, and her team in New York are very busy at the moment working on the Commission on the Status of Women process, including the negotiation of the final text. And as people may know, Ireland is represented through the European Union in this process, and as part of the European Union is calling specifically for measures to address the disproportionate impact of environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, climate change, and disasters, both sudden and long onset disasters, on all women and girls. And I think that's important, and I think it's something Ireland believes is important, that when we say women and girls, it's extremely inclusive. Ireland is in particular trying to ensure that special attention is paid to preventing and ending discrimination and sexual gender-based violence, and to support and strengthen the support for the role of civil society and human rights defenders. And we've heard today how very important that is, that human rights defenders, especially female human rights defenders, and especially, to come back to a point that Grace just made, women who are at the grassroots, they, by challenging norms at a local level, they risk suffering the criticism of their families, of their communities. They risk all of the damage and danger that men who go out and challenge these norms would experience, but they are ever more vulnerable because of their leadership role. So it's incredibly important that as Irish civil society, as Irish government, with the Defence Forces as part of the Consortium on Gender-Based Violence, that we keep on centering women-led organisations, and that we take a survivor-centred approach to ending gender-based violence, and looking at climate change through the lens of gender equality and gender-based violence is very important. And this is something that Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason would have said, which is that while the negotiations are ongoing, they're very painstaking, countries are at different points in their own journeys around policy, around gender equality and around climate change. And she would have made the point that it's unfortunate, and it's unfortunately not a secret, that both climate change and gender equality are two of the most contentious topics at the United Nations. So they are difficult to work on. But the role from Ireland, including the consortium, is to try and continually shift the norms, shift the thinking, so that there is a greater recognition consistently of how women and girls need to be centred in the analysis of the impact of climate change and in the response to climate change. And we've had some excellent, very practical articulation of what that response needs to look like from our three panel members today. There is also a very clear articulation of what needs to happen at policy level from states and from donors, and what international organizations, including NGOs, need to do in the policy paper that will be circulated to you today. And it reiterates many of the key pieces that have been called out today, such as the need for long-term flexible support to women-centered and women-led organizations, so that those organizations can respond to the specific needs of women and girls, and they can respond in a flexible way as things change over time. But also so that there's attention paid to the impact of corporates, for example, and the important role that international organizations and governments can have in pushing for a very strong and binding UN Treaty on Business and Human Rights to prevent the kind of corporate damage that we've heard Carolina speaking about. So I would like to finish by thanking all of our speakers, 3 tremendous speakers. Thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate your inputs, appreciate your insights and your recommendations. I would also like to thank everybody who came and participated in this session today. You will receive an email shortly with the recording and with the policy report. And we look forward to remaining in contact with you through the Irish Consortium for Gender-Based Violence. I'd like to wish you all the very best. Hope the rest of your day goes very well and look forward to being in touch again very soon. My thanks to you all. Goodbye for now.